be catching the recording later on. I think that one of the best benefits we've started to offer to our class members is just automatically sending out the recording as well, because I know how much plans change during this time, especially in spring when weather is nice and we think, well, maybe I don't want to sit in front of a laptop or a screen tonight, and we'll go outside and picnic. So you're always welcome to catch the recording if you can't join the live class. But also, like I said, I love signing in and seeing you all here. So, hi, Susan.
Amber, just one thing, I can't believe you guys sent us a Terrassi as part of, it's so good. This is one of our favorite wines, is the Terrassi. It's so yummy.
And, you know, Mastro Berardino is the producer that we will be saying this name over and over. So, you know, when Ryan and I, we kind of go together through the classes, and we make the class schedule, we decide what we think is the benefit for, you know, to teach for our friends and our students, our guests. And then we go through and we look at the wines, and sometimes we just make that decision. What do we need to send? Does this need to be, some classes we think, does this need to be the most classic example that we can find, or is this a class where we can introduce you to something new? And honestly, hopefully we're doing both tonight, which I think is a little bit of a perfect segue into starting to think about Campania. How's it going? I hear a little noise. I just wanted to make sure there were no comments. All right, so I'll go ahead and mute everyone at this time. I think everybody's pretty familiar with the idea that, of course, you have something to say, take yourself off mute. You have that available to you. Please utilize the chat box to talk to your classmates. I would imagine, hi Rachel, I didn't see you come in. Thank you. You also for emailing about the link tonight. I really, really appreciate the reminder. So if you've been to Campania, if you've been to Naples, if you've been to Capri, if you've been to Ischia, if you've been to Pompeii, if you've been to these places, please share your experiences in the chat box. We love to live vicariously through international travel right now. Still, I can't believe we're still saying that, but we are. So please feel free to talk about your experiences, tell people what you ate, what you drank, where you stayed, what you loved, and what you didn't love too. Both of those things are really valuable. So I think kind of talking about a great segue into beginning to discuss the wines of Campania. This is a new class for us. One of the things we're really trying to do recently is bring some new classes into the fold. This is because, you know, we want to keep you entertained. We want to keep ourselves entertained. And offering virtual classes actually gives us a little bit more freedom to offer a different style of classes than we necessarily could in person. Now, a region like Campania has enough distinct wines to do an in-person class and offer 6 expressions of almost completely different grape varieties from this region. However, it might not be as easy to source all of these different grape varieties or these wines. So I always like to talk about, you know, to start a little bit of the philosophy of the class that we're kind of about to engage in, right? So today we're talking about Campania. We're further in the south. It's a region that's less touristed, although of course Naples and the coast, the Amalfi Coast, is a touristed area of this region. But compared to Venice, Verona, Rome, or Florence, we tend to see less travelers coming this far south in Italy. It's less economically stable than some of its bigger neighbors to the north, although we do have a pretty large population for the south. It's one of the largest populations that we see here. The grape varieties are ancient. They're indigenous. Probably as a wine region, Campania might be almost obsolete, if not for the producers who are here who are championing and protecting these native ancient grape varieties and making really exceptional and modern wine from them. So I think it's something really exciting that we're seeing. Sorry, I don't know, I have like a little tickle in my throat today. I hope it's not too obnoxious for you guys. The culture is much more quiet here. The producers are not as boastful. They don't market their wines quite as much. Outside of Naples and the countryside, the area is pretty impoverished. But it's also important to understand that this is one of the bread baskets of Italy. Like when we think about Italian food in America, a lot of the food that we really think of comes from Naples. It comes from the region of Campania. The wineries here do not produce a lot of wine. We have Mastro Berardino, who's one of the larger producers within the area, also the benchmark producer for the area. We have Fiudi di San Gregorio, also another large producer. You've probably seen their Greco di Tufo, which we'll be talking about. But most producers are small, they're artisanal, and even though they have a small production, they produce a large range of wines. So most producers within Campania are making at a minimum 3 to 4 different wines from different areas within the region. Fiano di Avellino, Tarazzi, Greco di Tufo, right? We'll be talking about all of these regions. Some of them might even make up to 6 or 8 different bottlings. So that's one of the reasons we might not see them as much, limited production, small amounts of each bottling. We'll talk, of course, about the background and the history. We've been doing a lot of Italian classes. I don't want to spend too long on Italian history and Italian wine law. We'll touch on it briefly. Of course, we'll talk about the geology and the climate. It's fascinating in this region. The grape varieties, there are many. There are very specific ones that we'll focus on that you'll see most commonly if you do find wine from the region. But there are a lot of grapes that are grown in this area. And of course, we'll talk about most of the classic regions. We can't talk about them all tonight. And tonight's class, because we're focusing on a single region, it's going to have more numbers than I kind of really like to have in my classes. But I think that it's important so we understand stylistically the wines that are coming out of these individual regions. So I'll give you like minimum and maximum percentages for some of these DOCs and DOCGs of grape varieties. This is not for you to sit down and write these things down and memorize them. Even if you're studying for exams, those are things you study on your own, and then you use these classes for context, right? But I think it's important to discuss a few of these things that we see. So we're in Campania. We're further in the south. Rome is in Lazio, so right about here. And once we really come south of Rome, the export of wine coming from the southern part of Italy is much lower than many areas in the central or northern part. Sicily does export quite a bit of wine, but they have Palermo. They have a port where they can easily get their wine to for export. In Campania, in Basilicata, Puglia, Calabria, especially, this is a much more rural area. It's incredibly mountainous down here. It's much more difficult for these small producers to find importers that are willing to pick up and export their wine to other countries. So that's something important to keep in mind as well. The area in the south in general is much more impoverished than what we see in the north. And the population is much lower. So not only is the population low, but these are vineyards that are oftentimes incredibly difficult to work. They have to be done by hand. They're almost impossible to mechanize. So we see all of these different factors that sort of are creating this wine region, right? So what's a little bit of the history like? Well, we know a lot of the history of Italy, which is kind of the, really some of the fun stuff. But southern Italy, Campania, this is the land of the Greeks and the Romans. The Greeks came here, they named it Enotria, the land of the vine or the wine land. But by the 3rd century BC, there were vines throughout the peninsula. And the Romans were really spreading the growing of grapes and the making of wine. They most likely planted field blends. The Romans had a great aptitude for farming, like many of the monastic orders that would come after them. And in 121 AD, there was a wine called Falernum or Falernian, which was so renowned that it was popular for several hundred years from one particular vintage. So we'll talk about the possible grape varieties that could be. We know that the region and the grapes of the region were mentioned in a lot of historical Roman texts. They were mentioned by Pliny or Pliny. They were mentioned by Varro in the farming manual. They were mentioned in the natural history as well. All of these things are important. After the fall of the Roman Empire, we really see a decline in winemaking, but it's culturally very important to the Italians and to a lot of the people that came through these areas. In 1861, we know that Italy was unified. So today we have 20 sort of autonomous regions that are all part of the country of Italy itself. In 1963, we begin to introduce the DOC system, which we'll talk about, and I think most people on the call are actually really familiar with. And the DOC system, and now the DOCG system, is the quality system that governs how grapes are grown and wine is made in Italy. Now, not everybody really liked this system. Some people didn't agree with the laws in their particular region. So in 1992, we created what we call the IGT. And the IGT just covered a more general geographical area like Campania. So you could just release a wine from Campania and it wouldn't have any more specific area that it came from within Campania other than just the overarching area. You'll get that when we go into it in a few moments. Now, in the South especially, we really begin to see a shift towards quality. It's an area that's very traditionally grown grapes that are easy to grow, that are typically favoring quantity necessarily over quality. And we're really seeing a shift in that, especially in Campania. So really important to note that it really is the winemakers and the residents of these areas that are really pushing this shift towards quality. So we have a lot of history in Campania. We can't leave out Mount Vesuvius. So in 79 AD, Vesuvius blows. It buries three cities most specifically, but more than that. But we know Herculaneum. I thought I'd be able to say that, but now that I try out loud, I should have practiced. And Pompeii under 22 feet of ash. So one of these cities was really just incinerated and the other one was buried under ash. And what this ash did was that it actually preserved the city itself. It wasn't unearthed until 15 centuries later. And the interesting thing about this is that really revealed past Roman life and how they lived in dramatic detail, especially somewhere like Pompeii, which was kind of considered a very upscale, kind of rich ocean town. And within the town, there were great theaters. They know that in the theater, in the Colosseum, within the city, that they had a lot of taverns just inside, that they would sell wine. Within the city limits itself, I think there was more than 100 wine taverns as well. So we understand how important grape growing and wine was to Roman life during this time. Vesuvius is an active volcano. It's seen major eruptions in 1631 and also in 1944. These are major eruptions. There have been slightly minor eruptions since then. It's considered one of the most dangerous volcanoes in the world because of how close all of these cities are. So Naples, a population of 800,000 in the city limit, but close to 3 million with all of the suburbs. It's only 12 miles west of the summit of Vesuvius. Now the trade winds do come from the north. So the next time that Vesuvius does blow, hopefully it will, as it did with Pompeii, it will go a little bit further south. But even so, there's still more than 20 townships with 700,000 residents living within 6 miles of the crater of Vesuvius. So luckily now, of course, today we're able to monitor the kind of seismic shifts and things in the earth. I don't know a ton about volcanology, but hopefully we'll see that coming, unlike 79 AD. Now, what else is important about this? The replenishment of the mineral-rich ash from these explosions and from these kind of small eruptions of ash have made this an incredibly agriculturally important area. If Vesuvius was to blow, it would probably be crippling to not just the economy of Campania, but Italy altogether, because so much of the food and so much of the economy comes from agriculture in this area. Now, so we'll kind of talk about this in a second. I'm getting ahead of myself. Today, important to understand about the wines, we have 4 DOCGs. We have something like 14 or 15 DOCs, and we have 10 IGTs inside of Campania. Only 10% of all wine produced is at the DOC level. So that's much different than something like Piedmont, where like 86 or something percent of the wine produced is at the DOC level. But we're really seeing a renewed interest in quality. So we'll continue to see that percentage of the higher quality DOC wine grow up or continue to go up. So where's all that other wine going? Well, think about how much tourism, how many people we have drinking, 3 million people drinking the local wines of the region, right? So coming back to the idea of the mineral-rich ash coming from Vesuvius, it provides soil fertility. And it also, all these sort of pyroclastic flows and lava flows create different mineralogy, and they create a variety of microclimates on the slopes of Vesuvius. So you see sort of the different crops climbing up the side of the volcano. Usually the grapes are grown a little bit higher. They like the soils that are a little bit more depleted, but you see most importantly, tomatoes. San Marzano tomatoes come from this area. You see a ton of fruit trees, particularly peaches and cherries are really well known for the area. You see a lot of things like different nut trees, chestnuts, pine nuts are all really common. And when you begin to move south into the province of Salerno, there's 5 provinces. I don't want to confuse you too much, but kind of 5 provinces that we'll talk about within Campania. Further south is Salerno. This is a great region for agriculture. There's actually up to 4 or more harvests per year of the various crops that they have here. 1 harvest for grapes, of course, but just to bring into context how important all these crops are to the region. We have a climate that's both Mediterranean, closer to the coast. Salerno, Naples, Caserta, those provinces are Mediterranean. Benevento and Avellino, which are more inland, they're east of Vesuvius, are continental. And you really find a lot of your Falanghina, your Piede Rosso, which we'll talk about, more towards the coast. And you tend to find your Greco and your Aglianico further inland in the more continental area. We're gonna learn so much. You guys are gonna look at a map of Campania and you're gonna be like, I know where Greco comes from, Fiano, Aglianico, Piede Rosso, Granaccia, all these different things. So Italian quality system, we know it's modeled after the French AOC. In 1963, we created the DOC, saying that each of these individual regions was going to be controlled. And they're controlled by a set of laws that were decided on the historical importance of the geographical area where the grapes were grown, the traditional grape varieties of the area. So for example, Chianti Classico is a DOCG. The main grape variety is Sangiovese. It has to be a minimum of 85%, and it has to be grown in the smaller Classico zone, right? To meet all of those requirements to call it Chianti Classico. In the 1980s, we introduced the DOCG. This was one step up in quality from DOC. The wine in the bottle is controlled and guaranteed. Again, it's telling you that it is adhering to the region's specified geographical area, grape varieties, aging requirements, which is important in Italy. As we move south, we see less of this than we see in the north of the more traditional aging for these particular wines, but we will talk about aging in Taurasi and especially with Aglianico. But it is historically important that a lot of these wineries and these regions do age their wines at the property for an extended time before release. This is why Italian wines oftentimes tend to taste a little bit more earthy, right? They seem to be a little bit more mature. A lot of that fresh fruit has been stripped away and replaced with more tertiary characters. As you move south, you tend to get a little bit of fresher wine. They might oftentimes be released a little bit younger. So we'll talk about that. In 92, we introduced Goria's law. This created the IGT, so we can release wines as IGT Piedmont, IGT Tuscany, IGT Campania or Puglia or Sicily. Vino da Tavola is now just called vino. It's just wine, not wine of the table. And then the most important things I really like to talk about is the idea of Classico, Superiore, and Reserva. Classico is talking about the heartland of a particular region. Chianti Classico, Soave Classico, Valpolicella Classico, meaning that even though the boundaries of those regions have been expanded to Valpolicella, to Soave, to Chianti, there is an original heartland, a smaller area that usually means better quality. Superiore, we're usually talking about a higher level of alcohol in a wine, meaning that there was probably a better year and a better harvest for the grapes in order to support that higher alcohol level and the riper fruit. And Reserva is usually an extended period of aging, longer than the requirements of the DOC or the DOCG. And we'll see that as we go along too. All right, so that's all the housekeeping, right? So now let's get into a lot of the fun stuff. I don't know how many times you've really had an opportunity to look at a lot of different, photos of the geography of Naples, of Campania itself. But I think this really helped give us a little bit of an understanding to where we are and to where these different wine regions in Campania are in comparison to each other. So on the left-hand side here, you can see the Bay of Naples. Here we have Naples here, and here's Vesuvius. It's close, it's not far. If you've been to the region, Pompeii is down here. The city on the coast, Herculaneum, is over here. And then we see the Campi Flegrei, we'll be talking about that. The flaming field or the field of fire, we'll be discussing Ischia, and we'll be discussing the island of Capri down here. Now, all of the DOCGs are located inland. They're in the more mountainous area, and they're all pretty close together. All but one are in a region known as Avellino, but we tend to call it by its former name, its old name, which is Irpinia. And this is because Avellino is the name of a town. It's the name of a DOCG, and it's also the name of the province. So when we refer to all of these DOCG wines that come from the province of Avellino, in order to avoid confusion, we usually call it Irpinia. Here's just another topographical map that I really like to look at that kind of shows how I guess the word I'm looking for, how many people live in this particular area. So surrounding Naples in Campania, one of the most important areas for people to live in the south of Italy. But even so, still more rural than the north. So let's take a look at our DOCGs, most importantly. So we have three that are in this province again. We'll call it Irpinia. Greco di Ciuffo, known for white wine coming from the Greco grape. Taurasi, we're drinking a wine from Taurasi tonight, from Mastro Berardino. Taurasi is a red wine region based primarily on the Aglianico grape. And we'll talk about Fiano di Avellino, another DOCG based on the Fiano grape. Over here, for context, this is Vesuvio and also Lacrima Christi, also you might see. And this is a DOC. So it's not a DOCG, the highest quality like some of these other areas. We expect that will probably change in Italy. we'll continue to see some of these DOCs advance to DOCG. We'll continue to see some of these IGTs advance to DOC and then eventually advance to DOCG. After you've been an IGT for a certain period of time, you can apply for status to upgrade to DOC and so forth, and higher until you climb. So let's talk about some of these important ancient grape varieties. Falanghina. Falanghina is grown in all 5 provinces, but you primarily tend to see it as a more coastal wine. This is one of the grapes that possibly responsible for falernum or Falernia, that ancient grape or that ancient Roman wine that the vintage of 121 AD was famous for centuries afterwards, right? Now, in Campania, as is common in so many regions in Italy, almost all of these regions also produce some style of sweet wine. Now, economically, these aren't as important anymore, but historically, sweet wine production in Italy is incredibly important. So you will see a lot of these passito wines, especially coming from Falanghina. It tends to have a lot of aromatic lift to it, tend to have a lot of citrus blossom, a lot of zippy acidity, especially coming from the coast. You can imagine that this is what you have with your sardines, your octopus, your your Frito misto, your squid calamari salad that you might be enjoying in this region. Further inland, we tend to see Fiano coming from the region of Fiano di Avellino. This is a grape variety that's mentioned in A Natural History. It tends to be rich on the palate. One of those Italian styles of wine that builds a lot of texture without necessarily the use of oak. It tends to have more herbal and nutty flavors, chestnut, pine nut, a little bit of almost resin and honey character to it. The wine is not sweet, but it can be rich as well. We also see the grape variety Greco, we mentioned before. Many of these grapes are considered to be the ancestors of ancient grape varieties brought here by the Greeks. Greco, almost a direct translation of Greek, is an homage to that as well. Greco is one of the lighter styles of the white wines coming from Campania. It's a little bit more floral. It tends to be high acid and very mineral driven, which has a lot to do with the main area it comes from, the DOCG of Greco di Tufo, which we'll discuss. You also see in Vesuvio, Lacrima Christi, Coda di Volpe. So rare to see this on a label, although you might for an IGT style wine. Vadi Aperta is a producer I know, makes one of these. The name means tail of the fox. This is not necessarily that clever, but this is what the grape varieties themselves look like. They tend to be a little bit bushier. It's high acid. It has more delicate flavor and a more delicate aroma. It's not as often that you see Coda di Volpe as a single varietal wine, but it is used as the main grape in the Bianco wines of Vesuvius. Closer to the coast and on the island, you tend to see a blend of indigenous grapes, Biancolella, Ginestra, Vanille, Forastera, and Papella. Again, probably not common that you would see a lot of these terms on the labels themselves. Lots of fun whites, right? So, red grapes, Rosso. I should have mentioned this too. You guys were probably all looking at this like, what is happening here? So a lot of the sort of traditional vine training in the region does still happen. We tended to grow the grapes in what we call the pergola system, which is really common in Italy. It's very common in coastal Spain. There's a few reasons. When you're in a warmer or more humid area, as in many of these areas close to the coast, then even further inland in Campania, where there's actually quite a bit of rain, trellising the vines this way, meaning growing them tall and letting the fruit hang down underneath the canopy, help dry out the fruit. So it doesn't see as much mold or mildew. It also exposes the leaf canopy to the sun, encouraging photosynthesis. You have riper grapes. There's all kinds of reasons for this, right? Also in places, especially in the South, where we talk a lot about how important vegetables are, where in the past, a lot of family would have grown a lot of their own produce for their home. This also allowed you to grow grapes and then plant your other crops underneath as well. So another important reason. So this is a Fiano vine. I don't know exactly how old it is, but it is quite an old Fiano vine, as you can see here, being propped up with some posts. And it's just kind of gnarly looking, right? Like it's almost like a tree. It's pretty cool. Now this is quite different. So this is the experimental vineyard that's actually planted at Pompeii. So you can see Vesuvius here in the background. And this experimental vineyard is mostly run by the Mastro Berardino family. A little bit of a quick, very brief background is they were able to find a lot of the ancient grape varieties that were used, and they were things like Piedirosso, they were Aglianico, they were Chiastinoso, Tintoré. They planted all of these grape varieties in the 90s in these experimental vineyards in Pompeii. Some did better than others, especially for the red. They found that Aglianico actually didn't do that well, closer to the coast where we see it here in Pompeii. And now Mastro Berardino actually makes wines from these vineyards as well, which we'll discuss too. So Aglianico, this is the most important grape of Campania. It's their bread and butter. This is the wine that they really can charge some money for. You can make an incredible wine that ages for a very long time if made well and kept in the right condition. It is a very, very late ripening grape. It really can't be grown much further north than Campania. You also see it further inland, as I mentioned before as well. Now, for a long time, this was considered to be a Greek grape, but I think we have established that it's not, but it's still named for a Greek name. So this name comes from Hellenico or Hellenic, meaning Greek. It shares a lot of structural similarities with Nebbiolo and Sangiovese, meaning it's high tannin, it's high acid, but it doesn't have the same kind of red fruit and sort of floral characteristics that you get in Sangiovese and Nebbiolo. We always kind of say there's three really like noble red grapes of Italy, right? Nebbiolo in the north, Sangiovese in the center of Italy, and then we have Aglianico in the south. So I kind of sometimes like to compare it a little bit more to Cabernet Sauvignon because it has these sort of darker like berry, fruit and plum characters, a little bit of graphite. It developed this leather and cigar box. Some producers are choosing to age their wines with a little bit of new oak or more new oak rather than the more traditional old Bocchi as well. The main grape of Tarazzi, the main grape of Aglianico del Taberno as well. You also see Piedirosso. This is a blending variety in both Tarazzi and Aglianico del Taberno. So you'll see up to 15% of this grape variety in some of those wines. A lot of producers today do 100% Aglianico, and it's very common closer to the coast. You also see it quite a bit in Vesuvius for the wines of the DOC and in La Crema Christi as well. You see it on the islands where it makes these lighter, fresher, kind of berry scented wine with bright acidity. The tannins tend to be a little bit softer. And if you're thinking about sitting in Tarazzi, which is more mountainous and probably the food that comes from a more mountainous area inland, we're talking about lasagna, right? We're talking about pizza. We're talking about wild boar and things like that. We probably want to sip on that Aglianico. But if you're sitting in an island in Ischia or Capri, you're probably thinking about drinking, if it's a white wine, something a little brighter and fresher to go with the climate. So Piedirosso is that grape. You also see Chiastinoso. This is also common on Vesuvius. You see it in the islands. It tends to be a blending grape and also makes really fantastic rosés as well. A lot of fresh fruit. It's a little bit more tannic than what you get with Piedirosso. And then you also see native grapes like Tintoré, Pellegrino Nero, Casavecchia, and Guarnaccia as well, coming from the island too. A lot of stuff today, right? Great, okay. Checking in on you guys, seeing how you're doing. Everybody looks good. So let's talk about a few of these regions. again, I don't really want to sit here and, oh, well, this is 85%, and then you can have 15% of that. I don't usually think that that's a big advantage to the guests on these classes. But when we are talking about these specific regions, I think it helps to have an understanding. But knowing exactly that it's 85%, it's probably not to your benefit. But understanding that the main grape variety in these regions, and Campania makes it easy. They put the grape in the name of the region often, I think really helps us as consumers understand what we might be experiencing in the bottle when we go there or when we're here at our local wine shop. So Greco di Tufo, the grape is Greco. We talked about this a little bit earlier. Has a lot of acidity, tends to have a very distinct minerality. Oftentimes we hear from producers that Greco is the grape variety for a white wine that we tend to drink a little younger and fresher than something like Fiano di Avellino. But the grape itself and the wine itself, because of that acidity, really does have a phenomenal aging power too. So if you can get your hands on some of these sort of back vintage wines, I think that they certainly age well. I know for sure that the Fianos do. I don't see a lot of aged Greco. I see more aged Fiano, but I've heard from producers that it can be really fantastic. Now, a small amount of Spumante is also made in the area. The vineyards are high elevation here, so they have a lot of access to the sun for ripening, but we have that cooler, more mountainous continental climate and atmosphere, sort of maintaining all of that fresh acidity here, right? As we get closer to the coast, the wines are a little bit more, even the whites, a little bit more voluptuous, as we're in these temperatures that don't have as much of a diurnal shift, right? Greco is most commonly aged and fermented in stainless steel, so we don't tend to see a lot of examples that use oak, although there are some. And again, here we talk about that name again. You're going to keep hearing Mastro Berardino. Mastro Berardino, Antonio Mastro Berardino, was really instrumental in not just, he's known for his Terrazzi, he's known for his Aglianico, but he was really instrumental in saving and sort of, promulgating Fiano and Greco. So really important for these two grape varieties here, especially post World War II when he took over his family winery. There was all the money was going to the war effort during this time. There was not really any focus in Campania on these indigenous grape varieties, and he really became a shepherd for these grapes. Fiano di Avellino. So Greco di Tufo is here. Fiano di Avellino, you can't tell by this map, but is really quite a larger area. So you probably will see less Greco than you will see Fiano. Again, minimum 85% Fiano in order to label your wine as the Fiano di Avellino DOCG. We have clay soils here. Oftentimes that lend to a richer palate, which we know we get with the Fiano grape. Here we see more of both. We see producers that are making a little bit of fresher style of Fiano by aging their wine in stainless steel, fermenting in stainless steel. But you also have producers who are crafting a little bit of these richer styles by using stainless steel and oak or entirely oak. A lot of these producers, I know, like Antonio Caggiano, which we're going to talk about, he does a little bit of oak for his Fiano, but usually this is not new oak. Primarily, we're talking about a used barrel. It's really to add complexity and texture and the flavors that you get from a little bit of oxidation as opposed to the flavors of oak. Let me hear what they are. I know you guys know them. You're in these classes all the time. Again, what are the flavors of oak? Vanilla, butterscotch, cloves, cinnamon, nutmeg, right? Fiano still has great acidity too, but it has that richer palate. Greco's a little bit more tightly wound. Fiano tends to be, again, a slightly more resinous in terms of its texture. It develops these flavors of honey as well. And we're talking about Fiano di Avellino at the moment, but we're also going to talk about Fiano in Cilento when we get further down here in the province of Salerno too. These wines are so much fun. So we're doing the 4 DOCGs first. Aglianico del Taberno, baby Tarazi. We're a little bit further north than we are in Tarazi. So Tarazi is the purple area that you see here. Here we have Aglianico del Taberno, sitting inside of the larger region of Sannio DOC. Now, Sannio DOC and Falanghina del Sannio DOC are the exact same boundaries. The permits more white. Sannio must be from Falanghina. I think a minimum. I don't see anybody, so I'll just go back. I hope you guys can hear me. This is the only DOCG that we find outside of Irpinia, right? That larger province of Avellino, but we call it Irpinia, located here in the province of Benevento. Just like Tarazi, the minimum 85% Aglianico. It's common that many times these wines are 100% Aglianico. That could have to do with the changing climate. We can ripen Aglianico more reliably year to year. We've come across a lot better grape growing techniques than we've had for a really long time in the south of Italy. So a lot of that vineyard management, not necessarily just the changing weather patterns, have a lot to do with the quality of the grapes and the wine that are coming out of here. It ages for a shorter period of time than you find in Tarazi. So if you love Aglianico, but you want your wine to be a little less expensive because the producer doesn't age it as long, and you want it to be a little bit fresher in terms of its fruit profile, are you gonna drink Tarazi or are you gonna drink Aglianico del Taberno? You're gonna drink Taberno, right? I'll tell you about another one in a little bit too. Minimum of 2 years aging with Reserva. If you see Reserva on a bottle of Italian wine, it's always an indicator that that wine has been aged even longer. So you're going to get, again, a little bit more of those tertiary dried fruit flavors and earth than that fresh fruit. Rosado is really common, coming from the area, also coming from the Aglianico grape. And we tend to have less acidity here. Now, this is reflected in the laws of the DOCG that they require less aging, but the wines themselves also, once they are in bottle, don't have the ageability of many of the Tarazi wines made from Aglianico. Now, Tarazi DOCG, this is the bread and butter of the region. Now, many of the producers we're going to talk about, especially producers like Mastro Berardino, producers like Caggiano, producers like Terradora, which is the other part of the Mastro Berardino family, they're making wine in all of these DOCGs. We mentioned that earlier. They're making Greco di Tufo, Fiano di Avellino. They're making a Tarazi. They might be making an Aglianico from Taberno. And so what do they really make their money on? What's probably their pride and joy though? Usually the Tarazi, right? A lot of times, some of these other regions can offer the producers an outlet to release wines a little bit earlier on so that they have some cash flow coming into their winery. Definitely the most prestigious wine region in Campania. Just like Taberno, it's a minimum 85% Aglianico with other local red permitted. It's most common to see that other red, if at all, to be Piede Rosso, although it could be a number of permitted red grape varieties that we discussed. A lot of volcanic soils here. This is a red wine that is known for its distinctive minerality, a little bit of smokiness to this particular wine, a slight ashiness, but in the best way possible. We have a minimum of 3 years of aging to call your wine Tarazi. 12 months of that aging has to be in wood. It can be longer if you want it to be, but a minimum of 12 months. If you're putting Reserva on the label, that's a minimum of 4 years with 18 months in wood. These wines have a lot of firm structure. They're incredibly long-lived. They have, we mentioned before, more of those flavors of plum and black cherry. We see a little bit of herbal characteristics in these wines, but I would say call it more on the cigar box and graphite and leather and smoke that we kind of mentioned before. And the best examples are known to age for 30 to 50 years. And Mastro Borodino is really incredibly important because they actually have a library of wines that are going back 100 years, which is not very common for the region. Even if your family has been making wine in this region for a long time, it's probably uncommon that you would have kept a library of all of your past vintages. So that's something else that's really important, right? So one of the wines we're drinking tonight, coming from the next area we'll talk about, both of these areas, Campi Flegrei, Costa d'Amalfi, are DOCs. They're not considered DOCGs. Campi Flegrei is the Flaming Fields. We are just west of the city of Naples, just right over here. Again, incredibly volcanic soils coming from this area, primarily known for their wine based on Falanghina. So they do create a Campi Flegrei Bianco. This will be a minimum of 50 to 70% Falanghina, and then you'll see other grape varieties like Biancolella that we talked about. You might see a little bit of Fiano within this area. You might see some Coda di Volpe. You see a lot of varietal Falanghina, which we're drinking tonight. If it says Campi Flegrei Falanghina on the label, you know that that's 100% Falanghina. And then they make quite a bit of rosé and red wines based on Piede Rosso, that lighter, fresher, mineral-driven, bright acidity red wine that you want to drink closer to the coast. If we move further south, the Costa d'Amalfi, the Amalfi Coast, I'd love to hear from you guys. If anybody's been to this region, I haven't had the opportunity to go further south than Rome. So if you've been to the Amalfi Coast, if you've been to Capri, if you've been to Naples and Pompeii, you know, I'd love to hear about it. I'd love to hear your experiences. This is an area based on blends of these indigenous grape varieties that you don't often see elsewhere. So most of the time you'll just see the Amalfi Coast wines say something like Bianco on the label. And there'll be a blend of these different grape varieties, Biancolella, Finile, Ginestra, Ripoli, Papella that we talked about. These are grape varieties that over centuries of trial and error have adapted really to the region. So they can withstand, they have a little bit of thicker skin that can withstand the coastal winds. They might bud a little bit later just to make sure that we don't have too much berry shatter in this particular area. We do see a lot of the red based primarily on Piede Rosso as well, Tintori. We see some Aglianico, but it tends to be a smaller amount in the blend, just like we see in places like Vesuvio, Lacrima Christi as well. These are pergola trained vines. So much like we saw in that picture when we were looking at the Fiano, they tend to be vines that are trained up above our heads. We're close to the coast. Moisture is an issue here, right? We want to make sure that these grapes are dry and that these grapes are clean. That make the best type of wine. High altitudes here, up to 1,600 feet or higher. Marissa Cuomo, one of the most well-known producers of the area, it's considered that her Fior d'Uva, it's a late harvest barrel fermented white blend, is considered to be one of the best white wines of Italy. I've been looking for this wine. I haven't had a chance to try it. We want to find it for Cork Buzz. That would be so much fun. A couple of other producers you might look for are Giuseppe Apicella. He makes a wine called Stolen or Acciappata, made from a blend of Piede Rosso, Schiacinoso, Monte di Grazia, making wine from primarily the Tintori grape. Moving to Vesuvio. We talked a lot about Vesuvio already. You know, I think to me, I'm one of those people, I love to travel. I came to wine because of my love of travel. As you've mentioned, you've heard me say it before, especially when it comes to Italy. Why do we love talking and learning about Italian wines? Because Italian wines are a blend of history. They're about art, right? They're about culture in this particular region. You can talk about different grape varieties every day of the year and never run out of grape varieties to talk about. And Vesuvio also has a lot of that romanticism in it because of its history, because of its eruptive past, right? So Bianco, we know, based on that Coda di Volpe, it tends to be that grape variety that is acidic. It's a little bit more gentle in terms of its aromatic and its flavor profile, but that's a really great expressor of these incredibly mineral volcanic soil that we see coming from Vesuvio itself as well. Rosés, Rosados tend to be based on Piede Rosso. We see some Aglianico, Schiacinoso, Olivella, the grape that looks like an olive, clever name, right? And even a few white varieties that you might find can be blended into your rosé or your red. Why do we do this in Italy? Well, we are in Campania, especially to the coast. It is a warmer Mediterranean area. If we have a warm year on top of that, we might consider using some of those white grapes in a red wine to add a little aromatic lift, to add a little bit of acidity to that wine. In 96, Mastro Berardino planted vines in Pompeii at this experimental vineyard. They began making wines, I think, in 2000 or 2001 from this vineyard. They continued to play with the grape varieties. At first, they planted a lot more Aglianico. As I mentioned, it doesn't do quite as well. We're talking about Pompeii, like right down here in this area, doesn't do quite as well, so close to the coast. And also within Vesuvio, a smaller DOC called Lacrima Christi means the tears of Christ. And a lot of Italian wine regions have these sort of poetic stories about their names. And Lacrima Christi, the tears of Christ, they say that as Lucifer fell from heaven, he grabbed the piece of heaven on his way down, and that piece of heaven, as it fell to the earth, became the Bay of Naples, this area of really unparalleled and absolutely incredible beauty, right? And Jesus Christ was watching this from heaven as he began to cry, and as his tears fell on the earth, vines sprang up in the ground from where his tears fell, and these sort of became the grapevines of this region. So Lacrima Christi follows the same DOC laws and rules that you see in Vesuvio DOC, but we see a higher minimum alcohol percentage, meaning we know that the grapes are a little bit riper and a little bit lower yield. So Lacrima Christi in general should be considered to be the higher quality version of the Vesuvio wine, but they're coming from the same grape variety. The whites are based on Coda di Volpe, and the reds are going to be based on the Piede Rosso. All right, cool. I see a question about the Cruna del Lago, and we're definitely going to get to that. So I want to talk about just 3 more regions. So one is Cilento, the last 2 are going to be islands, and then we're going to talk about the wines, we're going to talk about food. What are you ordering tonight to go with these wines? What are you hungry for? And now that we've been talking about food from Naples and wine from Campania. But we're here now in the south. Cilento is one of Italy's most beautiful areas. It is part of a national forest in Italy, in the province of Salerno as well. It's one of Italy's poorest provinces. The difference here in Cilento, just how far south it is of Vesuvio, right, or of Naples itself, is stark in its difference. It's a very rural area by comparison. And we have a few winemakers in this area that are really using their wineries as something to raise the region. They're using their wineries to hire workers for year-round work, which can be really uncommon in wine, unfortunately, because you need a lot of people during the harvest and not very many people the rest of the year, which is one of the unfortunate realities about owning a winery or a vineyard or making wine itself. They don't have the lucrative tourist trade of Naples, of Vesuvius, of Pompeii, of the Amalfi Coast. It's very dependent on agriculture here. Olives, orchard fruits, grapes are incredibly important. unlike the coastal areas further north, the main grapes here are similar to the more inland areas. So the whites are based on Fiano. The reds, or excuse me, the rosés are actually based on Sangiovese, one of the only DOCs in the area that's based on the Sangiovese grape, which we typically find further north. And the reds are based on Aglianico. You might see Cilento Aglianico, the minimum of 85%, as opposed to Cilento Rosso, which is just 60 to 75% Aglianico. This is an incredibly beautiful area. Producers like Bruno Di Concilis, one of my favorite producers for wine in this area, are really doing what they can for the social sustainability of the region. They're one of the newer wineries that really working to hire people from the region to work at their winery, to work in their vineyards full time. Really important. He's a huge jazz fan. You'll find that a lot of his wines are named for musicians, but spelled backwards on the label, like his Selim Cilento Rosso, Cilento Bianco is Miles spelled backwards for Miles Davis. San Salvatore is another favorite of ours. These wines are inexpensive, which makes them, one, so fantastic. They also make a lot of cheeses coming from water buffalo in the area, which can be really, really great. And Luigi Maffini as well, you might see three of our favorite producers coming from this area. If you head to Capri, if you head to Ischia, you're going to be drinking bright, light white with seafood and bright, light reds, right? That's what we're drinking on the island. We're not having a lot of Aglianico with that rich, leathery, graphite, big tannin characteristic to it. These are offshore tourist destinations. A lot of the wine is designed for the local consumption. Falanghina, Greco, Biancolella, Piedirosso. On Ischia, you oftentimes see a grape variety we don't see many other places. You see it a little bit along the coast called Guarnaccia. An intensely colored grape, a little bit more tannin than what you find for Piedirosso, but still a really fantastic kind of richer expression of island wine. Now, right before we get into these two producers, and you'll get, again, I'll send out a little bit of a follow-up and outline with all of this information. So we don't have to remember it all right now, but I just gave you all of this great information and you're like, okay, Amber, you said Mastro Berardino like 3 dozen times during your presentation. So we know about Mastro Berardino, right? They're the ambassador of Campania, the benchmark, the reference point. They make Tirazi, they make Greco di Tufo, they make Fiano di Avellino, all of the 3 DOCGs that are located in Irpinia, right? Now, maybe you want to drink something from Terradora di Palo. Terradora di Palo is the Mastro Berardino family. Now, Antonio Mastro Berardino, who we're going to talk about in a second, and his brother Walter had a falling out in the 1970s, and they split. Antonio took the Mastro Berardino name, and Walter took the majority of the vineyard. So the other half of the family makes wines under their label from the original Mastro Berardino vineyards, which is the Terradora di Palo that you'll see here. The wines are not as good as Mastro Berardino. The quality is good, but they just don't have the same sort of ageability and intensity of the Mastro Berardino wines. Luigi Tecci, the favorite of ours, very small artisanal producer, very ultra traditional vinification techniques, all matured in large casks. Lots and lots of old vines on his estate, very concentrated and rich styles of wine. He also makes a Campi Terracini DOC wine, which is baby Tirazi. It's aged a little bit less. It can be released a little bit younger, but it's almost a DOC with very similar boundaries to Tirazi, also coming from the Aglianico grape. Antonio Caggiano, a favorite of ours, is Beccar, coming from Fiano di Avellino, rich and textured and luscious, but without being sweet. It can be really fantastic. Fiudi di San Gregorio, you probably have seen this in wine shops. It's pretty common. I think it's one of the most common Greco di Tufos that you might see. Has a lot of that beautiful bright floral and mineral character to it as well. They're one of the largest producers in Campania, so you'll see quite a bit of wine from them. They also make Tarazzi. They also make Fiano di Avellino. And they also say, I love this quote, and this is kind of, to me, a very Italian thing, that a bottle of wine and a work of art share the same process when they're being made. We also really like Donna Chiara. Here you see a Falanghino coming from Beneventano, which is not the province, but an IGT, and also Antica Herpina. They have a master sommelier behind them, too. That was a lot, right? Talking about Campania for 1 hour. I wasn't sure that it could be done, but I think we could have kept on going because we haven't even talked about the IGTs. We didn't talk about most of the DOCs. We didn't talk about a lot of them. We talked about the main ones. You see Asperino here. Asperino are the main grape. They do a lot of sparkling. Falerno di Massico. So primarily Falanghina here, primarily Falanghina in Galluccio. And I think also they are one of the areas that's also based on Aglianico as well in this particular area. This could be where the Falernium wine of yore comes from. So we think that the Falernian may have been a reference to the place or the terroir, and not necessarily the grape variety, which is why some texts claim that Falernium was made from Falanghina, and some texts claim that it was made from Greco. I don't want to say that like Jancis Robinson is wrong, but I don't want to say that like Tom Hyland is wrong, who's another great writer, wine writer for Italian wine. I don't know which one's right, but maybe it's possible that the name was the name of a place and not the grape variety itself. So let's talk about some wine. So I saw a little text pop into the chat about a little bit of spritziness and a little bit of carbonation. Oh, it's good, Scott. I'm just saying, Scott and Angelique, I'm just saying that you guys went to the Amalfi Coast. I love that. You have to tell me a little bit more about it later, next time you come in for dinner. So Luigi Di Meo, and this is a really interesting wine to me. This is one of those opportunities to talk about the difference in vintages. And I think I put 2016 here, but that's not right. This is 2018. The last vintage that we tried of this wine before ordering this for class was the 2016. This does have, to me, when I opened it up, there is a little bit of spritziness to this wine. There is a little bit of carbonation, which is a little surprising to me because the Cruna del Lago is their sort of reserve bottling. Still fermented in stainless steel, but it's coming from the best parcels of their vineyards, coming from the Campi Flegrei. We're in that coastal volcanic area that's to the west of Naples here. But I quite like the aroma and the flavor. To me, you tend to get a lot more lemon curd characteristic. I was slightly surprised at how actually kind of honeyed this particular wine was, and more in that sort of textural and flavor way, not because the wine itself is sweet, but I could certainly see sitting down with this wine. There's still a lot of really fresh acidity, right? And actually now that I've had this wine in my glass for probably like an hour and a half, and a lot of that initial spritz is actually gone. So when I first tasted the wine around like 5 o'clock, it was like, oh, I don't remember that being in the 2016, but it's actually gone in my glass now. And really what I'm left with is just this honeyed texture, this kind of like peach fuzz texture on the palate, and a lot of that really like bright, almost like salted lemon curd. So what would you have with this? I mean, it can be an aperitif style wine, but I think it also could go into a full dinner. But like, you know, I mean, I would say any charcuterie or aperitif style food, that seafood salad that you tend to get here, we'll see a picture, octopus, squid, we might do a little bit of caprese. I think this could also go really well with like a lemon inspired spaghetti, right? Maybe lemon and ricotta. Maybe some squid or some clam with that. This would be really great with clams in general. Just have this with clams. I think it could even stand up with that acidity to the San Marzano tomatoes as well. So Mastro Borodino, I'm not tasting this one with you. We sent out the last of these wines to all of you on the call that ordered these wines, but they're certainly some of our favorite. Established in 1750 by Pietro di Borodino, Mastro was actually awarded to the family name later on for their skill in grape growing and winemaking. So the actual Mastro Borodino winery was established in the mid to late 1800s, but they were growers of grapes for many generations, even before that. But it was really Antonio Mastro Borodino who committed to a lot of the native grape varieties, as we mentioned earlier, most importantly, Fiano and Greco, especially these white wines. He was an uber traditionalist when it came to aging his wines, but his son Piero had taken over. And the wines are made in a little bit more of a modern style now. So Antonio always made his wine in the large Slovenian oak or boti, where there was no imprint of new oak into the wine. Radici means roots. The style of wine has been made since 1928, but it's been released as Radici since 1986. You can find wines going back to, the 1930s, the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s. They're known to do vertical tastings at the property themselves as well. This wine is aged 24 months in French barrique. We see a little bit of Slovenian cask or Slovenian oak, large boti, ages 24 months in the bottle. They say that the life expectancy of these wines can be 50 plus years. However, what I really love about the Mastro Borodino wines is I really think that they drink well at every age. Sometimes you get a Brunello or you get a Barolo or a Barbaresco, and you know that the wines aren't ready because they're so intensely structured with tannin and acidity, and they haven't developed all that beautiful tertiary bouquet of age yet. But I think that maybe the climate of being further south, maybe the Aglianico grape, and this is 100% Aglianico, by the way. I think that it has a fleshiness in its youth from fruit that still stands up to the structure of the acidity and the structure of the tannin. I'd love to hear what you guys think though, so let me know. But I won't keep you all night. I always feel like I go like 8 minutes over. So what are you gonna eat tonight? You're drinking the Falanghina, you're gonna have this classic seafood salad, octopus, clams, mussels, shrimp, the bounty of the Bay of Naples, right? That little piece of heaven fall into the earth. You might try the very classic vongole, the clams with spaghetti and tomato sauce, these fresh San Marzano tomatoes that come from Mount Vesuvius. You might have Napolitana pizza. Like to me, like this, like I would eat this all day long every day. I love margarita style pizza. It's one of my favorites. I love the simplicity of it. And when you get to just taste great ingredients, one on their own, I love it. If you're further inland, we're going to be having something richer with our Aglianico, right? We're talking about the baked style of pasta. Lasagna, lasagna, lasagna. Lasagna with spinach, lasagna with meat sauce, lasagna with cheese, lasagna with tomato sauce. And although we didn't talk really much about the passito or the sweet style wine, the sfogliatelle is one of the most common desserts coming from Naples, from the south. These wines are great. Or excuse me, these wines. These desserts, these pastries, these sfogliatelle are so good. If you live in Brooklyn, there's a place called Romans in Fort Greene on DeKalb. They make them on Saturdays and Sundays, and they're so worth trying. There can be really, really incredible pastries to have. How are we doing? What kind of questions? Rachel, I love that. Leftover lasagna with the terrazzi. Ron, is your spritz kind of dissipating at all in your Falanghina? What about the Kaufman? Did you get a little spritziness too? Or Rachel?
So we did actually, or at least I did. So I was mentioning it to Angelique earlier. at the very front end of it, we got some of that. I was curious about it myself, so we did.
So I wanted, because I just opened it up before class and I hadn't tried this particular vintage. I didn't have time to look into what it could have happened with this wine or if that's intentional. But I would say that most likely it just, when they bottled the wine, it still just had a little bit of natural carbonation to it, especially because they fermented and aged the wine in stainless steel. So you don't have any of that. You're in an inert vessel, so you don't have an oak barrel, whether even if it's used for some of that carbon dioxide to escape through, right? So you have that exchange of oxygen. So I would say it would just, when it was bottled, there was just still a little bit of carbon dioxide that got trapped. But as I went back to mine, that really has dissipated and gone away. So
Yeah.
One of those things, wine is different every year. And it's one of those things really to be celebrated about these particular wines.
Yeah, we really enjoyed it. It was really good.
And what about the Tarazi, Mastro Borodino?
It's one of our favorites. We love that wine.
Excellent.
Yeah.
It's really good. I find I often get the Frutti de San Gregorio and some of the others from Basilicata, but this is really nice. And I think it'll be, I mean, it's definitely like better with, sort of really good with food wine instead of something I think of as sipping as much, but I really enjoyed this. And, I'm almost a little bit sad. I'll have to go out and buy some more to sort of see how it holds up for a decade or so. But
Well,
I didn't try the Falanghina yet. I decided to limit myself to opening one bottle for today, but I will let you guys know whether I have the spritz when I open it.
Well, we love hearing from you and what you think about the wines, and getting your feedback as well. So please don't hesitate to let us know. I really hope, of course, that you enjoy your dinner, enjoy your wine for the evening. Thank you for spending an hour with us talking about Campania. And I'll see everybody soon.
Thanks, Amber.
Have a great night. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Amber. That was great.
Great class.
Thank you. Night.